Mason Reed was checking his fence line when he saw the burlap sack floating by Miller's Creek. He thought it was just old rags, until a tiny hand reached out and a voice barely louder than a whisper said, "Mama." What he pulled from that sack would change everything. The morning sun was just breaking over the Texas hills when Mason Reed saddled up his old horse, Thunder. It was going to be another long day of checking fence posts and mending wire on the Double Bar Ranch. At 45 years old, Mason had been doing this same routine for over a decade now, ever since he lost everything that mattered to him. His wife, Emily, and their baby son had died in a house fire 10 years ago, and Mason had never been the same. He kept to himself, worked hard, and tried not to think about what his life could have been. Mason was a tall man with weathered hands and kind eyes that had seen too much pain. The other ranch hands respected him, but knew better than to get too close. He had built walls around his heart so thick that nothing could get through. Or so he thought. As he rode along the creek that morning, checking for breaks in the fence, he noticed something floating in the slow-moving water. At first, he figured it was just trash that had washed down from upstream. People were always throwing their old stuff in the creek, and it usually ended up caught in the branches along his section of the ranch. But something about this particular bundle made him stop. It was a burlap sack, the kind used for feed, but it was moving slightly in the current. Mason dismounted and waded into the shallow water to get a better look. The sack was tied at the top with rough rope, and it was heavier than he expected. As he lifted it from the water, he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was the faintest sound, barely audible over the babbling creek. A whimper, a cry so weak it could have been mistaken for the wind. Mason's hands shook as he carefully untied the rope. What he saw inside that wet, dirty sack would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a baby girl, maybe 8 or 9 months old, with matted blonde hair and blue lips. Her tiny body was cold as ice, and she was barely breathing. But when she saw Mason's face looking down at her, she opened her eyes and whispered the word that broke his heart into a million pieces. "Mama." For a moment, Mason couldn't move. He just stood there in the creek, holding this dying child, remembering his own baby who had called out for him in those final moments 10 years ago. But this time was different. This time he could do something. This baby was alive, and she needed him. Mason quickly wrapped the little girl in his heavy coat and climbed back onto Thunder. He had never ridden so fast in his life. The baby was getting weaker by the minute. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin was turning blue from the cold. Mason pressed her close to his chest, trying to share his body heat as Thunder galloped toward town. "Hold on, little one," he whispered. "Just hold on." The baby's tiny fingers gripped his shirt, and she looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for such a small face. She was fighting to stay alive, and Mason was going to make sure she won that fight. As they rode into town, Mason's mind was racing. Who could do such a thing to an innocent child? What kind of monster puts a baby in a sack and throws her in a creek to die? But there would be time for those questions later. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting this little girl to Dr. Michael Stone's office. Mason had never been much of a praying man, but he found himself begging God to let them make it in time. The baby's eyes fluttered closed just as Mason reached Main Street. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was too late. But then she took another breath, and her little hand tightened around his finger. She was still fighting. Mason kicked Thunder's sides one more time and raced toward the doctor's office at the end of the street. People stopped what they were doing to stare at the wild-looking cowboy racing through town with something bundled in his coat. But Mason didn't care about anything except the precious life in his arms. Dr. Stone's office sat on the corner of Main and Church Street, a small white building with a red cross painted on the door. Mason had only been there once before, when he'd gotten kicked by a horse and needed stitches. He never liked doctors much, but Dr. Stone had a reputation for being good with children. Mason prayed that reputation was true as he slid down from Thunder's back and ran toward the door. The baby was so still now that Mason had to put his ear close to her mouth to make sure she was still breathing. Her breath was warm against his cheek, and he felt a surge of hope. She was alive. She was going to make it. She had to make it, because in the space of 20 minutes, this abandoned child had already begun to heal something in Mason's broken heart that he thought was dead forever. As Mason burst through Dr. Stone's door with the dying child, he had no idea that this moment would put him on a collision course with the most powerful family in town, and a secret that could destroy them all. Dr. Michael Stone looked up from his morning coffee when Mason Reed burst through his office door like a man possessed. The cowboy's face was pale as winter frost, and he was clutching something wrapped in his coat like his life depended on it. "Doc, you gotta help." Mason gasped, his chest heaving from the hard ride into town. "I found her in the creek. She's barely breathing." Dr. Stone had been practicing medicine in this small Texas town for 20 years, and he'd seen plenty of emergencies. But when Mason unwrapped that tiny bundle and revealed the half-dead baby girl, even the experienced doctor felt his stomach drop. The child was blue around the lips, her skin cold as marble, and her breathing so shallow it was barely visible. "Get her on the table now," Dr. Stone commanded, his gentle bedside manner replaced by urgent professionalism. Mason laid the baby down carefully, his big hands surprisingly tender as he smoothed her matted hair. The little girl's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, as she made a soft, whimpering sound that cut straight through both men's hearts. "How long was she in the water?" Dr. Stone asked, already reaching for his stethoscope and warming blankets. Mason shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know, document. Could have been minutes or hours. She was tied up in a feed sack and just floating there like garbage." The next hour was the longest of Mason's life. Dr. Stone worked with the focused intensity of a man fighting death itself. He wrapped the baby in heated blankets, checked her temperature, listened to her tiny heart, and carefully examined every inch of her small body for injuries. Mason refused to leave, pacing the small office like a caged animal, jumping at every sound the baby made. "She's hypothermic," Dr. Stone explained as he worked. "Her body temperature is dangerously low, and she's dehydrated. But she's a fighter. I can tell already." It was during this crisis that Grace Harper arrived. The 35-year-old schoolteacher had been walking past the doctor's office on her way to the general store when she heard the commotion inside. Grace was known throughout town as a kind woman who kept to herself since losing her husband in a mining accident 5 years ago. What most people didn't know was that Grace had also lost a baby daughter to fever just 6 months old. She'd sworn never to hold another child again. The pain was too deep. "Dr. Stone, is everything all right?" Grace asked, poking her head through the door. When she saw the tiny baby on the examination table, her hand flew to her throat. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The child looked so small, so helpless, just like her own daughter had been. "Grace, thank goodness," Dr. Stone said without looking up from his patient. "I need your help. This baby needs constant care, and I have other patients to see. You're the only woman in town I trust with something this delicate." Grace wanted to run. Every instinct told her to turn around and walk away before her heart could break all over again. But when the baby opened her eyes and looked directly at her, Grace felt something she thought was dead forever stir in her chest. What happened to her?" she asked, stepping closer despite her fear. Mason spoke up from his corner, his voice rough with anger. "Someone put her in a sack and threw her in Miller's Creek to die. What kind of monster does that to a baby?" Dr. Stone had managed to stabilize the child's temperature, and her breathing was becoming stronger by the hour. "She's going to need round-the-clock care for the next few days," he explained to Grace. "Feeding every 2 hours, keeping her warm, watching for any signs of pneumonia or fever. I can't do it alone, and Mason here looks like he hasn't slept in a week." Mason bristled at the suggestion that he couldn't handle it, but one look at his shaking hands told the truth. He was terrified of doing something wrong. Grace found herself nodding before she could stop herself. "I'll help," she whispered, and immediately wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. But when Dr. Stone placed the baby in her arms for the first time, something magical happened. The child, who'd been restless and fussy, immediately calmed down. Her tiny hand wrapped around Grace's finger, and she made a soft cooing sound that was the most beautiful music Grace had ever heard. Mason watched in amazement as Grace began to hum softly, a lullaby that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her memory. The baby's eyes grew heavy, and for the first time since being pulled from the creek, she smiled. It was just a tiny upturn of her lips, but it was enough to bring tears to both adults' eyes. "She likes you," Mason said softly, and Grace nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. Over the next 3 days, Mason and Grace took turns caring for the baby. Mason learned to change diapers with his clumsy cowboy hands, and Grace showed him how to test the temperature of formula on his wrist. They barely spoke to each other at first, both too afraid of getting too attached to this child who might be taken away at any moment. But gradually, as they watched the baby grow stronger, they began to open up. "I had a daughter once," Grace admitted on the second night, as she fed the baby by lamplight. She would have been about 5 now if she'd lived. Mason nodded, understanding her pain better than most. "I lost a son," he said quietly. "House fire. 10 years ago. I thought I'd never want to be around children again, but this little one, she's different." The baby finished her bottle and reached up toward Grace's face, her tiny fingers touching the tears Grace didn't know she was crying. It was Grace who first called her Hope. "She needs a name," Grace said on the third morning as the baby babbled happily in her makeshift crib. "We can't keep calling her the baby. Look at those eyes. She's seen the worst this world has to offer, but she's still fighting. She's still hoping for better days." Mason smiled, the first real smile anyone had seen from him in years. "Hope," he repeated. "I like that. Hope it is." The baby seemed to respond to her new name, turning her head when they called her Hope, and even attempting what sounded like Mama when Grace held her. Dr. Stone was amazed at her recovery. "I've never seen anything like it," he told them. "Yesterday, she was at death's door, and now look at her. It's like she knows she's loved." And she was loved more than any of them had expected. Grace had lost her fear of attachment, and Mason had found a purpose he'd thought was gone forever. Hope had just taken her first solid food in Grace's arms, managing to swallow a few spoonfuls of mashed vegetables without spitting them up when Sheriff Williams burst through the door with news that made everyone's blood run cold. "Someone's been asking questions about a missing baby," he announced, his face grim. "They're offering a $1,000 reward for information. Whoever abandoned this child, they're looking for her." Sheriff Williams closed the door behind him and pulled up a chair. His weathered face was serious as he looked at Mason, Grace, and little Hope sleeping peacefully in Grace's arms. "I've been doing some digging," he said quietly. "This wasn't an accident. Someone deliberately put that baby in the creek, and now they're trying to cover their tracks." Mason's jaw tightened. What kind of person does that and then comes looking for the evidence? Grace pulled Hope closer, her protective instincts flaring. "They're not getting her back," she whispered fiercely. "I don't care who they are." Sheriff Williams held up his hand. "Now hold on. We don't know who they are yet. All I know is that Mayor Thornton's assistant came by my office yesterday, asking if anyone had found a missing infant. Said it was a family matter that needed to be handled quietly." The mention of Mayor Thornton's name made everyone in the room tense. Richard Thornton was the wealthiest, most powerful man in 3 counties. He owned the bank, the largest ranch, and half the businesses in town. When Thornton wanted something done, it got done, no questions asked. "What did you tell him?" Mason asked. Sheriff Williams shrugged. "I told him I hadn't heard anything about a missing baby. Technically true, since Hope here wasn't missing. She was abandoned." Over the next few days, word spread through town about Mason and Grace's unusual living arrangement. Some folks thought it was sweet, watching the gruff cowboy learn to be gentle with a baby while the quiet schoolteacher came back to life, caring for little Hope. But others whispered behind closed doors about propriety and what it meant for an unmarried man and woman to be raising a child together, even temporarily. Grace tried to ignore the gossip, but it was hard when women stopped talking whenever she walked into the general store. "Let them talk," Mason said one evening as he watched Grace give Hope her bottle. "They don't know what they're talking about." But Grace could see the worry in his eyes. They both knew their arrangement was fragile, built on nothing but love for a child who wasn't legally theirs. It was Maria Gonzalez who finally brought them the truth. The mayor's housemaid had worked for the Thornton family for 15 years, cleaning their big house and keeping their secrets. But this secret was eating her alive. She found Grace at the schoolhouse one afternoon, wringing her hands and speaking in rapid whispers. "I cannot stay quiet anymore," Maria said, tears streaming down her face. "That baby, she belongs to Miss Rebecca, the mayor's daughter." Grace felt her world tilt. Rebecca Thornton was 19 years old, the mayor's pride and joy. She'd been sent away to visit relatives 6 months ago, and no one had seen her since. "Rebecca had a baby?" Grace asked, though the pieces were already falling into place. Maria nodded miserably. The family, they were so ashamed. A baby with no husband, it would ruin their name. They sent Miss Rebecca away and told everyone she was getting an education back east. The full horror of the situation became clear as Maria continued. The mayor, he told his daughter the baby died during birth. Miss Rebecca, she cried for weeks, thinking her child was dead. But the baby lived, and the mayor, he paid a man to take care of the problem. I heard them talking. They said the baby would be better off dead than growing up with the shame. Mason felt sick to his stomach. So they had Hope thrown in the creek to die, and now they're looking for her because they're afraid someone might connect her to their family. Maria nodded. The mayor's worried. Too many people asking questions about Miss Rebecca, about where she really went. If people find out about the baby. Grace looked down at Hope, who was babbling happily and trying to grab at Grace's hair. In just 1 week, this child had become the center of her world. The idea of giving her back to people who had tried to kill her was unthinkable. "They're not taking her," Grace said firmly. Mason nodded his agreement. "Over my dead body." But even as they made their vows to protect Hope, they all knew the truth. When Mayor Thornton wanted something, he usually got it. He had money, power, and influence that reached every corner of their small town. What did they have? Just love. And sometimes love wasn't enough to win against power. Hope had begun calling Grace Mama clearly now. And when Mason held her, she would pat his cheek and babble what sounded like Papa. She was thriving under their care, growing stronger and